This was kind of my first sense of Silicon Valley. It was a clear step up in terms of sort of just raw intellectual horsepower, intensity, and I came to the conclusion that data fundamentally is human, right? It's generated by humans, it's ultimately consumed and analyzed by humans. Machines can help, but machines alone, I don't think, can be trusted in all cases to make the right decisions. Humans just don't scale exponentially, right? So, if the problem, however, scales exponentially, you have to find some sort of other way of solving the problem. That's the bar that you need to set for yourself, that your system is as tight as you can possibly make it.
You're listening to the Enterprise Ready Podcast, a show aiming to change the enterprise software narrative from how to sell to enterprises to how to build for enterprises. We'll interview industry experts and enterprise software founders as we break through the jargon, establish a common vernacular, and share the lessons learned from building the world's best enterprise software. Hi, I'm Grant Miller, creator of Enterprise Ready and founder and CEO of Replicated, where we enable cloud-native software vendors like HashiCorp, CircleCI, Snyk, and many others to operationalize and scale the distribution of their modern on-prem applications. Check us out at replicated.com. The Enterprise Ready Podcast is brought to you by HeavyBit, a program dedicated to helping startups take their developer products to market. For more information, visit heavybit.com. If you're interested in being a guest on this show, or if you'd like to suggest a topic, or just learn more about enterprise features, find us at enterpriseready.io. In this episode of the Enterprise Ready Podcast, I sit down with Christian Began, co-founder and CTO of Sumo Logic, a log management and security analytics SaaS company. Christian and I cover a variety of topics throughout a pretty in-depth conversation. We first get an overview of Christian's background in software and his eventual move into deep enterprise software. We focus on his time at ArcSight, a traditional SIEM vendor, where he joined as an early engineer and eventually rose to chief architect. We explore many of the challenges that ArcSight faced, including the standard challenges of first-generation on-prem software businesses and the moments that led to the founding of Sumo Logic. We dig into the early thesis of Sumo Logic, as well as the early challenges and pitfalls. From there, we explore the evolving security landscape that has shaped multi-tenant SaaS companies like Sumo. We then swing over to a few other emerging trends around AI and Kubernetes. Finally, we conclude the conversation on how Sumo Logic is embracing a new use case of providing data insights to inform business-level decision-making. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope that you will as well. All right, Christian, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me.
So let's just dive right in. Tell us a little bit about your background and then how you made it into enterprise software.
Right on. So I am currently the CTO, and I also founded the company at Sumo Logic for the last 10 years. We got started in 2010. Before that, I was early developer and then grew with the company. Ultimately became chief architect at an enterprise software company called ArcSight. That was in the previous decade. I started in 2001. And I am originally from Germany. Grew up in Germany, went to school in Germany, went to university in Germany, and came over to the US for the first time as an intern in late 1998. So that's all code for saying I'm really old.
Cool, yeah. And so the first jobs you had, 98, was that an enterprise software company, or did you start kind of in consumer?
Back then, I don't know how they would classify themselves back then, but it was a small company called Amazon.
Amazing. Wow.
Yeah, it was a total complete coincidence. I went to a school of applied science in Germany, doing a mixed or sort of a blended program that had computer science and sort of media and internet in the widest sense. I started that in 1996. This is roughly around the time when the internet became a thing in Germany, probably like maybe a couple of years after it became in the US. But, get pretty close. I worked construction that summer. I took the money, bought a modem, got like one of those Superfax 28K modems, and, dialed in and kind of never hung up since to some degree. Kind of got completely, sucked into sort of the network. I was actually at the time still studying social sciences, which is also sort of interesting in its own way. But I had been playing around with computers, when I was a kid, kind of taught myself programming when I was like 11, 12 years old by going, to the library and, pulling these, dot matrix printed books about BASIC and what have you, Commodore 64 and all that stuff. And kind of did that. It was just sort of a little bit self-driven. And as I got into high school, of course, other things became more interesting. And Didn't really go back to that. I was politically active, as a student a little bit, that kind of stuff where things that you sort of paid, like that you can kind of get sucked in when you're still a little bit younger, representation and those types of things. But that led me to eventually then go and, study social sciences, which is, politics and sociology, right? But it never really, it didn't really stick. I wasn't really that interested in it. But you need to write a lot of papers when you do that kind of course of studies. And so I ended up getting a Mac. And then as soon as I had that Mac, I was back into just hacking around, right? And then the internet happened, so the Mac was what I hooked up that Superfax to, and that's what got me to I dialed into some local mailbox or some sort of pseudo AOL thing or so in Germany, I think for like a day or two, some sort of message board or what have you. But then, there was, Netscape Navigator and the internet, and that's just basically never stopped, right? So I still live in a web browser on some level, many different web browsers and many different tabs today. But so that was 96, right? And I basically decided that I should probably, because I was really interested in it, and I would read books, I would buy books, and I got hip to Linux and back into programming. And then, I ran across this program, which was like in a small school outside of Berlin. And, I fancied myself an artist as well, just like everybody who had a copy of Photoshop, right? Apply all these filters. Yeah, you're an artist. And, it turned out that I wasn't actually that much of an artist, but I was one of the few people who actually knew how to program in this particular college program. And so that I eventually then in 98 got me an internship programming. And it was with a small German company called Telebuch, which sold books over the phone and then increasingly so over the internet. And that's where I got the internship. And, between getting the confirmation in the summer and then starting it in the fall, guess what? These guys got bought by Amazon.
Oh, interesting.
And to this day, this was the foundation for the sort of German department of Amazon in Bavaria. So they're still, I think, there. And so this internship basically then turned into, hey, let's go to Seattle and do something. And so that's how I ended up at Amazon, right? Through no fault of my own, but it actually did happen.
That's cool,
right?
What were you working on at Amazon like that summer?
So we did a prototype of a greeting card site. One of those things where you kind of pick a funny picture and write a text and like you send up to your parents like a sort of virtual greeting card.
Yeah.
At the time, there was a very successful site by the name of Blue Mountain Arts. They might still be around. I have not really been in the sort of greeting card game for a while, so I'm not entirely up to speed there. And there was a hypothesis that they looked at their uniques and, they were basically, completely different people than that would shop at Amazon. And they said, hey, there's if we can do something to like pull these types of users in that don't seem to come to Amazon at all, if we can grab them with like this sort of greeting card product, then, maybe we can also start selling them stuff. It was a very high level sort of, thesis to some degree, also driven by, the German guys that had gotten acquired and they needed to sort of, figure out something to do. And anyways, that was kind of our internship. It was pretty random. We were some of the first people writing Java code at Amazon at the time. It was kind of interesting. And we were sitting in a basement there in downtown Seattle. It was pretty wild, the whole thing.
Yeah. How big was Amazon when you joined?
Oh, man, I have no idea. I would have to look it up. But like they didn't really even have a single building. I mean, they were like already big enough to not fit into the whatever like initial like little office they had in downtown Seattle.
Yeah.
So they were all spread out, First Street, Second Street, blah, 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 all there. Yeah. And when we would have to go, across town to sort of do meetings and stuff like that. And they had like a little like a data center, which like in a big building in downtown, Second or whatever it was, I forgot. We got to drop a server off there once, and there was like this big Sunbox.
Oh, right.
Sunbox in the back, that had a label on it that read "Mom." I still, still find that pretty funny. So that must have been their master database or what have you. I don't know, but different times, right? So I mean, they were obviously already a thing, but clearly not to the degree. I think they were already public at the time.
Oh, okay.
Right, but like they went, if I'm not mistaken, but that happened all super quickly. Like I mean, in sort of, their whole timeline was just ridiculously accelerated. Right?
Yeah, I mean the timelines for all these .com companies that age was just so fast, right? You think about like 18 months to IPO kind of timeline. So
yeah. But what I remember there was like one really cool thing is like we had like a, many years before they actually implemented it for all the customers, we had kind of a quote unquote preview of the Prime functionality, because basically when you ordered something, you would go to some sort of internal login and then you would get the full catalog, right? And so you order a book or something. They were guys who would basically next day drop it off at your desk.
Oh, wow. That's kind of cool.
And so that was just outstanding, right? We were like, holy shit, that's pretty cool. So we kept ordering stuff.
Oh, that's funny. Did you also have any kind of previews for the stuff like AWS, like sort of infrastructure as a service while you were working there, as in building sort of?
Not at all.
Not at all. Okay, so that was still totally not a thing yet.
No, they were still doing OB-DOS, and even I think that original backend, if I'm not completely mistaken. And again, I was at best a visitor in that world, right? I mean,
sure.
I don't really, but I believe this OB-DOS thing that they had initially was all written in C, and when we showed up writing some Java code, there were some sort of eyebrows raised. But they had already started acquiring companies, and I remember there was one company called Jungly that I think they did some sort of comparison shopping thing, and they got acquired out of, and then they had already some Java backend. So we ended up talking to those guys a little bit. So they sent one of their more senior engineers over from that acquisition, who had done a lot more with Java than we could have ever imagined. Because, remember, we were very young and we had no idea basically no idea what we're doing there. But so anyways, we built that prototype. Of course, it got scrapped. And, I think at some time later, they ended up for a little while running a greeting card site, but that's also long gone.
That's, yeah. Oh, wait, they still don't have a greeting card site? That's too bad.
They had one. One in between. Yeah.
Then you went back to school and then you started a company while you were in school or something? Is that what happened?
Yeah. So what happened, right? There in Seattle, and this was just literally in late 98, early 99. I mean, everybody's heads was exploding, right? I mean, it was just this incredible boom. And, we had sort of, gotten brought in to do this internship by the, German founders of that German company that had been acquired, right? And, they were running around in Seattle and they were entrepreneurs at heart. And they were too entrepreneurial to fit into the sort of Amazon system at that time, right? And they were running around trying to figure out what to do, and they had some ideas, and of course they had made a bunch of money, so they could finance that also, and so there was all these startup ideas floating around, and I got sucked into one of them, which was kind of a language translation thing, because we were all German and our English was not that good, and we were trying to build things that make it easier to learn English and maybe even online translate web pages and stuff like that. That was the high level idea, right? And so one of those, German founder types basically went and, started that. And I was sort of part of that. And that was really only for a couple of months. It got started in Santa Monica and, long story anyways, but it was Santa Monica. And then the other office was in Berlin. That's where I was living at the time and also going to school, right? And so they built that up, and then people started falling out over there. There was something going on. I didn't even really know what was going on. There were some business guys that were brought in, and then of course the business guys ended up not liking each other. The usual stuff.
As is the common, startups going under because of co-founder disputes, right? It happens.
Yeah, it was. I honestly never really found out exactly what was going on, but frankly, I really didn't care either. So, because there was one person there that had come, to sort of run the sort of operations, really like a COO type that came over from the US, actually from Miami, because these guys had connections over there as well. It's all very complicated. But anyways, this person showed up, and we liked her. And then, me and my buddy Stefan, who is actually, still working with me, and he's a chief architect at Sumo now. We basically went and, started another company with this person from Miami. And because the idea was that it would be nice to have access to your files, from the internet. If you're in an internet cafe, I don't know if you remember those, but there used to be times where not everybody was online and you had to go to a place, right? And
sure.
Not everybody had laptops at the time, and obviously no phones and all these things, right? So, long story short, we had this sort of basic idea of, building kind of a file system in the internet, like a web browser kind of, like a Dropbox thing,
sure.
Right? The great redemption in this, because we completely fucked that up, right? But from an execution perspective, we had no idea what we were doing. But the great redemption is that I can always now refer to Dropbox, and everybody goes oh,
And that was Gigaton?
Yeah, that was Gigaton. It was cool.
Okay.
We were having a lot of fun. So that's what got me permanently.
But it was targeted at sort of like consumers rather than targeting enterprises. Is that right?
I'm not sure it was even targeted at anybody in that sense. I mean, we just thought that this needed to be in a thing, and we kind of started building it, right?
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, during that time, we grew it out. There was like, I don't know, 30, 50 people or so at some point, sitting there outside of Fort Lauderdale in Miami. And
wow,
it was all pretty wild. And then it didn't go anywhere. But, we ended up going around and, talking to some VCs, trying to raise more money. We had some trips to to Boston, some trips to Silicon Valley. That's one of these, like, that was kind of the first time I was ever in a bunch of these VC offices and, met those types of people. And nobody would give us any money. But, technically people, even then we're still, and this was after the bubble had burst, like now we're talking early 2001, right? Technical people, as always sort of in short supply. So, talking to all of these VCs ultimately netted me an interview at a company of one of those VCs that they had just incubated, and that turned out to be ArcSight.
Oh, interesting. So you had kind of been going around pitching Gigaton to all these different investors. No one really wanted to invest in the company, so you wound it down. But then one of the things that happened was you got an interview with ArcSight.
Exactly. So, they didn't want to give us any money, but they were like, hey, maybe you can work for one of our companies. and that was awesome because it got me, I still remember this, Hugh Gimanzi, who is the, one of the founders and the CTO of ArcSight. He gave me a call, and I was like driving down the freeway in like an old beat up, Honda Civic in Florida. And like, he started asking me coding questions on the phone, and so it's pretty funny. Anyways, I went out there and I met them in Sunnyvale. That was like early 2001, and I was like by far the smartest set of people I've ever met. I know that sounds like a bit of a cliche, but like I was just completely blown away, and it was just incredible. I mean, I could sort of see, like this was kind of my first sense of Silicon Valley. It was a clear step up in terms of sort of just raw intellectual horsepower, intensity, and I guess I was in Seattle and all of that, with Amazon, but like probably a little bit too far removed from where all the smart people were, because we were like working on a little dinky prototype there. But like that interview that day, I remember, was just complete. That just blew me away, right? And I ended up getting the offer, and then like in April 2001, I moved all my stuff over from Florida,
and so this is pretty early in their life cycle, right?
Yeah, they were probably half a year old, or maybe at this point, maybe 9 months or something like that.
And what was ArcSight?
Yeah, so ArcSight grew up to be a security information and event management, software, so an SIEM. So this is basically software that takes logs, right, from security devices, from security software, from all of these different sort of security point products, and centralizes it, so that you have kind of a central, point of view, can run analytics, rules engine to detect threats on the top of all of the sort of point product output. And that was sort of the big thesis, right? And they had come across that by, interviewing lots of customers, and they told them that's a real problem. And so they built a company around that, right?
Okay, cool.
So yeah, there was basically a meta product that was sort of a security analytics, you could say, but also lots of data management underneath, because we brought all of these log files together in a big database, and then lots of sort of real-time analytics on top of that. So it was pretty cool. It was clearly, when they pitched it to me, it seemed like this makes sense. Not that I knew a lot at the time, but like it just seemed to make sense, right? You have various vendors, and they kind of see, especially in security, there's a lot of sort of best of breed buying going on, right? And there's always lots of innovation as well, right? So you might have, Cisco networking gear, but you might buy a firewall from Check Point back in the day, right? Or you have an IDS from ISS back in the day, but like you wouldn't buy all of these different things from the same vendor. That would not often happen, right? Because you would go after the vendor that had the best product for this particular purpose. But then what you ran into is that you didn't really have a centralized way of making sense of all the output, right? So you would set up the firewall, and it, if you're lucky, it would, block things. Or you would set up the, intrusion detection systems. And if you were lucky, it would sort of find the 5 bytes that feel like, beginning of shellcode or something. And you would look into the various vendors' management interfaces, but you had to do all of this, correlation, I don't know, on paper or on your head or what have you. Obviously, that's not great. So we brought all the data into one place, and gave people a kind of control station, for that, and that was cool, still cool.
And did that category exist? Like, SIEM, was that a thing?
No.
Okay.
No, it wasn't. The name that stuck was that name, right? And that's one of those things that Gartner made up, as they want to do, dealing in abbreviations and stuff. So
sure.
ArcSight was very early in that space. There was, I think, maybe a product or two out there. Like there was probably a year or so older. There was something called Net Forensics out there that's going after something similar. And I think there was one more. I forgot the name of that. ArcSight ended up
probably all founded around the same time, I'm guessing.
Yeah. As this always happens, right? Within a year or two of each other, something like that. Is if I remember correctly. Yeah. And ArcSight ended up becoming the category leader. Ended up being very successful. Being all the way up into the right in a Magic Quadrant, and ended up going public. In early 2008, right before the crash. And usually when I show up somewhere, things crash. When I came to the US, for Gigaton, it was like in March 2000, right? So yay. And then ArcSight went public, and then a couple months later. So by the time the lockup came off, the market was basically fucked, right?
You were at ArcSight far longer than you didn't just join and it crashed. You were there, from the beginning. So
I have absolutely no illusions about anything anymore at this point, right? It is what it is, and
I think it just proves you have staying power. Despite the ups and downs, you'll stay, stay the course.
So the thing that I've seen, right, and that's what helps, is that it is cyclical, right, but it always recovers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you want to do your thing, it's like go to market, or in ArcSight's case, looking for an exit or what have you, right? There's all these timing considerations. But you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Nobody can see these things coming, right?
Yeah.
And then you just have to stay through. And if you set up the thing properly and you have enough money in the bank, and maybe have been conservative with spending, or maybe raised a little bit ahead, to have buffer, then usually things turn around, right? The economy has this.
In our lifetime, it seems to go up into the right eventually, right?
Yeah. Exactly, right? And it certainly bounces back after a couple of years.
The long arc of history.
Yeah, I've seen it twice now. Who knows?
Cool. And I mean, so you were very involved in the engineering side, both as sort of lead engineer, and then eventually as chief architect. So, were there any sort of key lessons that you learned at ArcSight? Because realistically, this is your first enterprise software company. So, when you first stepped into that role, do you remember what your perspective was, how that changed, how you sort of adapted to sort of building for enterprise customers?
I wish I could say I've kind of developed a grand theory or something, but I really haven't. What I've observed, and to some degree, this still applies to this day, is it's not easy to get to something that, customers actually need. So this Gigaton thing, this whole files in the internet and so forth, right? We never established product market fit, right? But the ArcSight product market fit was pretty clear. Sumo was also pretty clear. So we never really had to struggle with that, right? So as soon as you got it built, people will start using it, right? So there's a whole aspect of, how do you kind of go from nothing to something, around, experimenting and product market fit and so forth. And, what are the sort of lessons that people have learned around, not overbuild and not get stuck, make sure that you keep yourself, agile, and you can kind of tear down something and, build a wholly different sort of product in a couple of weeks, just to basically support that idea of finding product market fit. That all makes a ton of sense to me. And theoretically, I totally get it. But personally, I have not been in that situation, right? So it basically starts after product market fit, basically, right? So I guess I got lucky there, or I don't know how you want to put that, but so my experience comes from that, right? And then what I've seen is, as soon as there's even one customer, right, and one leads to three, and then 3 leads to 15, et cetera, and you have a sales team. Of course, it doesn't always work perfectly in the beginning, and sales team struggling, et cetera, of course, always, right? But there will be deals, there will be POCs, there will be, eventually people will buy. At that point, it's just basically an incredible tornado, right? And you end up being, your default mode is being reactive, right? And so somehow you have to figure out, in that kind of, onslaught of every day being completely different, you have to somehow figure out how to not lose complete control over the architecture of the system. And that's very hard. So that's always how I've seen that, right? And then the way that I've always felt that that's best managed is by, trying to be pragmatic, right? If you go too dogmatic on, how you implement things, then, and you go away, and I've made that mistake as well, go away and say, hey, we can completely redesign this part of the system because clearly now we know more. And, back then we were anyways idiots. So, how could we have even done it the way that we did it? But, once it's out there and once customers are using it, you're not going to ever kill it. So there's a bunch of lessons that I learned there where, you just have to live with, everything you do basically has is going to stick around for a long time. I don't know. There's no magic formula there, right? You just basically have to be pragmatic about it and, basically be able to kind of at any given point in time, continue to be able to evolve the system.
Sure. So, I think the key lesson there being like just in enterprise software, generally, like once customers start using something, it's very hard to deprecate and take things away. And so you sort of have to constantly evolve your system, without complete rebuilds, I guess, is what you're saying.
Exactly, right? And it's not like you can it's not like an internal software for, I don't know, some sort of insurance thing or what have you, where you can go in and, run a domain-driven design process or something, which I would love to do at one point. But, because your user base is right there, right? And it's kind of captive and you can talk to them. When you build these types of products that I've been involved in, there's a lot of guesswork involved, right? And it's not that we don't talk to users and customers. Obviously we do, right? But for these types of sort of softwares and platforms like we do with Sumo now, the use cases are so broad and wide. You have to have a good amount of intuition there, right? And the feedback that you're getting is not always, very well sort of structured. So you end up having to sort of adjust your thinking a lot and just hope that, your basic idea about what this kind of product should be doing and sort of the basic bones of the architecture are going to survive, right? And at ArcSight, we made a bunch of decisions in the beginning that ended up being, real bummers, over the years. And then we introduced like specifically the data backend, like we're talking logs, right? So that's sort of semi-structured, data. Sometimes people say unstructured, but technically it's semi-structured. This is not something that fits into sort of a classic RDBMS, right? Which is sort of the default backend, I guess, if you have something where you need to store data and then also query it, right? But it doesn't really fit well. And these days it's a little bit different, but like back in 2001, there wasn't a lot of sort of alternative database technologies out there. So we ended up going with Oracle, and we kind of sort of abused Oracle into essentially being kind of a append-only store for sort of log events. And that worked out for a couple of years, but then eventually we got to a place where the thing was so successful. And, as we know, data even back then was already on this sort of exponential, growth curve. And, that applies to security data and, these types of like log events 100%, right? Going from like 50 events per second to 500 events per second to 5,000 events per second, ingested and processed and correlated and so forth. And then people started showing up and they wanted 50,000. Right? And at some point, what we found was that, the way that we had originally architected it just wouldn't scale out, right? It was monolithic, right? With an app server and a database. And I learned a lot about Oracle, including that it simply, the classic database just does not scale out, right? And that was a big bummer, right? And that was something that we sort of kind of half knew in 2001, but there was really no other choice because going and building it like in a clustered fashion, like, it was a funny discussion. We basically raised our hand back then and we said, hey, we should really kind of like put a clustering, or we called it clustered sort of architecture back then, in there as a foundation. But it would add about half a year, to the release timeline of version 1, right? And the business was not, didn't really want to hear that, which to some degree I also understand. In hindsight, it amuses me to think that we thought back then that we could get that done in half a year. So probably the business was right in not allowing us to do that because it's probably taken a lot longer.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking when you first said it. It's like, yeah, we estimated it 6 months. I was like, and that would have stretched to how long actually, right?
Right. And then I guess in hindsight, you just basically, you can take like a glass half empty view and say, hey, you just can't win, right?
Yeah.
Because you do this and then you have a successful product, but then eventually you run out of runway. Or you take a look at it and you say you're more optimistic about it and you just say, hey, well, but we were still around in 2008 when this has become a problem because the product was so freaking successful.
Yeah.
And I think I continue to as much as I would like to do the right thing every day and in the beginning and halfway through and what have you, still actually being there and same with Sumo, right? And having a right to play, beats making only the right decisions. Hands down, because nobody can.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I always say it's kind of like that's future Grant's problem in terms of decisions I make now that I know will incur some debt later. But that's kind of what debt's for, right? It's like the opportunity to incur a little now.
But man, a part of that is I have also seen where this can really kind of become a problem. I mean, the core ArcSight product, the enterprise security manager, which is the thing that I worked on. I guess if there's any ArcSight people listening, we might have this debate or something. But, I do think that this like initial architectural limitation, that we baked in order to get it to market and which ultimately made it successful, eventually then also opened up the door for others to disrupt, right?
Right. But I mean, and you could have disrupted yourselves, but you didn't. And so...
We didn't. We tried, actually. That attempt was made. We built a appliance version that had like a custom data store. Well, that was very fast. It was very fast. I think it didn't really distribute because, again, that just adds to the complexity of the problem. But it was custom built. It was pretty fucking fast, right? And so it could go, at very high sort of event ingest speeds, hundreds of thousands and so forth, right? But then it didn't really know how to do the correlation. So then we had to kind of, club it together. So you had to buy software and hardware. And then, eventually, people came around that had like a better more big data style, MapReduce style architecture. Splunk comes to mind, for example. They did that really well. Mm-hmm. And they ended up causing, post 2010 or so, they started causing a lot of trouble for ArcSight.
Yeah. And so you stayed through the IPO. Any quick insights from the IPO around just ways that challenged you as a technologist and an architect?
I mean, IPO generally, since I've been through it now once, as an employee, it can get pretty emotional, right? Especially if you have something where you go public, lockoff comes off, and, you are basically under issue, right? And, people who thought they're going to walk out with, I don't know, 100 grand and now, look at 30 grand or what have you, apply your scaling factor. Mm-hmm. So that can become, on a tactical basis, very hard to manage for individuals and for the company, and, in terms of getting people to stay motivated and so forth. So then basically you have to decide: am I going to sell and just f off, or am I gonna have trust that this downturn will turn around and so forth, right? And so then in early 2009, what happened was President Obama started giving a bunch of speeches around the importance of cybersecurity. And anyways, as the market started bouncing back a little bit, there was additional, we got a bunch of additional media attention, through this sort of cyber angle, right? Because it's fundamentally a sort of cybersecurity play, and then the markets picked up on that. So thanks Obama, I guess. And so in the end, folks that actually were able to kind of stick it out for a year or so. Stock price ended up going up and so forth. And then a little bit more when the acquisition happened. And so it was a cool experience. I think a bunch of us actually ended up with a couple $100. And, so down payment money basically in the Bay Area.
Yeah, sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Enough money to run a small country, but over here, it's basically a down payment for a small house. Right. So that was cool. Right. And, I really do, in still looking back, I'm still extremely grateful to the ArcSight, leadership team and the guys who hired me back then, because it was a fantastic experience, both professionally and, I ended up making a little bit of money and, set me up to do something else. It was fantastic.
Yeah. So let's jump into that. So you leave ArcSight, and had you already kind of had the idea for Sumo Logic, or kind of what's the founding story? How did it come about?
It had been in my head. So the story there is that, rewind to 2008, we ended up on a hunch going to Stanford for sort of an open talk by a guy with the name of Werner Vogels, who, of course, is the Amazon CTO, and who was talking on the topic of AWS, right? Amazon Web Services. And this was 2008. I think they had only done that thing for about 2 years at the time, right? I think they had S3 and SQS and EC2 or so. I think those were the sort of foundational services that they had, right? And I remember, being geek enough to sort of read stuff on Slashdot and then, Hacker News and so forth. We were sort of aware, but I don't think we had really understood what it was that they were doing. It just sounded like, this is really weird, doesn't fit into any category. What are they doing? Okay, next article, right? But
Sure.
it was somehow there was a hook in my head, and so kind of we went and heard Werner talk, and he did like a 90-minute thing, and I don't know if you've ever had a chance to sort of hear him keynote. He's just an incredible speaker, and he has this ability of contextualizing, like in this case AWS, like why what they are doing benefits customers, right? And then of course he's a professor in Cornell, and he can go and talk about distributed consensus and all these kinds of things, right? But like as a CTO, what he really brought across to us as a technical audience wasn't necessarily how EC2 worked or how S3 worked, but why what it did was sort of uniquely enabling, even back then, their like early customers to do just like outrageous stuff, right? Like Animoto was a thing back then, right? This thing where you upload a bunch of pictures and it sends you back this, ridiculously overproduced video, right? Which was a huge thing. And they went from like having like running it on a Game Boy somewhere, right, in somebody's closet, to somehow, suddenly they had like, I don't know, 10,000 videos uploaded per minute or so, and then they scaled that out on EC2 basically overnight, and so all these super cool stories about scale, and then he had lots of other stuff that he was talking about, and long story short is that walking out of that talk, it became very clear that what they were doing there, what it was that they were doing, why they were doing it, and also why it was, just ridiculously awesome from the perspective of, enabling developers to do even more. Basically, what was clear at the time was that they already had started to turn a data center into an API, right?
Right.
And so as developers, I'm, sure you'll empathize with that. We know how to sort of automate things, right? That's kind of, we write code to make computers do things, right? That's kind of our superpower, right? And now we can automate entire data centers. That basically means that, we can maybe, think big about building, hosted systems, building SaaS, those types of things without even having to know the people that know all about the racking and stacking and the networking and the cables and all of that, right? And so what that left us with was sort of this idea that, hey, what if we recast what we were doing, and maybe we can solve some of the obvious problems that we were seeing with the enterprise product at the time, by turning it into SaaS, and not just that as an abstract idea, but with AWS as a sort of substrate for that, actually realistically achievable, right? Because clearly if there's an API, we can make it dance. So that was very formative. And I remember the parking lot discussions. There were a bunch of other ArcSight guys there, including Kumar, who then became my co-founder in Sumo. And, we immediately went from, hey, this makes perfect sense, to, okay, so how can we harness this, for the stuff that we are doing? And not necessarily from the perspective of immediately going and starting a new company. It was just like, hey, how does this apply to our day-to-day stuff?
Sure.
Right. And so I think that was kind of the nucleus of the idea, to basically, and the idea is very simple, right? Is to say, this type of product, this type of data consolidation, and then, central analytics platform, is incredibly useful. We've seen that from the success, that ArcSight had, even just in the security space. Logs obviously are something that as developers we are very familiar with, right? And so, we even had written our own sort of remote log analytics tools to sort of remotely debug, failing servers at customer side and so forth, right? And this was definitely going to be, a thing, that was potentially not just interesting for security, but for other use cases as well. So that's the good news, right? But like all of this type of product was kind of, delivered as enterprise software, had problems scaling. And, we just made this experience that customers struggled so much with installing and administering it that they had, it often felt like there wasn't that much time left to actually use the product. And to us, it was very unsatisfying, right? Because we built a product so people can use it, not so we can be on the phone, to sort of debug, again, broken Oracle data files, right?
Right, because for the ArcSight sort of, implementation, you were basically delivering, was it one like jar file or WAR file, or what was the primary bits?
Yeah, basically, I'd had an installer, but it was basically dumping a big Java application, right? And then there was like a 300,000 page manual on how to exactly configure Oracle.
Right. And so like your customer had to set up like their actual servers, rack and stack physical servers, and then like bring in the Java runtime, and then Tomcat, and then set up Oracle databases, and set up, like configure the Java application, and then Did the actual application scale horizontally, or did the application scale only vertically as well, the monolithic application?
No, only scaled vertically.
Okay.
And it didn't even do that so well, frankly. There used to be this company called Sun Microsystems, right? And,
Sure.
they used to build these really large boxes with like 12 or, 24 or 48 CPUs in them, right? And we're talking 2003, 2004. And since our stuff was written in Java, people were like, oh, we're just going to like throw it on this, E10K or something, right? Or a Sunfire of some sort. So we went over there, there where the Facebook campus now is in Menlo Park. That used to be a big Sun campus, and that was where their performance lab was, right? It was pretty cool because they had like an entire lab set up, and people that were managing that, so you could come in and test your software to see if it scales out to the big iron, basically. And we did something very similar with IBM at some point as well. And so one of the cool things on that I forgot, it was a Sunfire of some sort, right? So it has 24 CPUs, right? And of course, our code was written in Java. It was multi-threaded, and of course, it would scale and all of these things. Right? That's what you think.
That's what you walked in believing.
Exactly. And then you actually run it on a machine that has more than 2 cores or CPUs at the time. They didn't. It was actually proper CPUs, right? These giant boards. It's very cool. But they had this like widget that basically showed you each CPU in a row and how much basically the CPU usage, right? So the dancing meters, basically the CPU meters, right? And there were like 24 of them. And our application would basically run, and it would keep all 24 CPUs busy for about 10 milliseconds, and then it would go and basically everything went to zero, and one CPU ended up garbage collecting for like 4 seconds or so.
Amazing.
Because clearly, if you don't actually test this type of stuff while you're developing it, it's not just going to scale out, right? So that's the sort of funny side story where like even vertical scaling is actually not that simple.
That's really funny.
So of course we ended up like, making a bunch of fixes and so forth, right? But that was always a struggle, right? And, we had like customers at the time in the sort of on the government side and military and so forth, and they had all this iron lying around, and they were like, oh, it's going to run, no problem, right? It's not that easy, right? And so, the story there is that as obviously useful, what we were trying to do there was also sort of on a day-to-day basis, there was a lot of kind of grinding in making customers successful. Right. And, I was kind of, core server guy, and, I ended up on the phone, trying to remotely debug things so many times, ended up like, taking over a lot of time, didn't actually spend developing. And then, it was more and more people like maintaining this thing. Ended up, I think to some degree also, taking a real bite out of the innovation budget. And then so we saw all of that, right? And we then saw, the rise of Salesforce, completely like killing Siebel. And like, I think ServiceNow was already starting to become a thing. And we had early on, I had some exposure to Remedy. And so I knew about that, and, and I knew how that like went down. And so this idea of basically classic enterprise software being, just completely disrupted by software as a service, startups, right? I mean, there was already sort of an emerging pattern there, right? And then
just to kind of reiterate, just like how it was just so difficult to set up these applications like ArcSight. Like there was so much overhead, and then to your point, every customer was doing this on like some slightly different environment.
Exactly.
And so your team was like, basically, everyone's trying to repeat the same effort to get this thing to run, and it's like you can't even really scale it vertically, and there's all these challenges, and so, and then you've got the actual physical hardware that like someone like tripped over a cable, and like that's why it stopped working, and like you have all these different things that can go wrong, and so then to your point, like SaaS evolves and like takes away all of this operational overhead, just says like, don't worry, like we'll host it, like we'll manage it, we'll scale it, we'll run it. And that's kind of, the point you're at now, right?
Exactly, right? And for me, this was just, I didn't learn that by reading a book or so, right? Like this just came out of doing what we were doing. And it was the kind of hard-earned, I guess, wisdom. And at least sort of in our space, it turned out into a bit of an unfair advantage. And, knowing about that and then formulating the idea that this had to become SaaS, right? And that's ultimately what the sort of founding idea behind Sumo, right? Not necessarily do a completely different product, because we thought that basic product orientation was very useful. Maybe broaden the aperture or what have you. And then it turned out to, not initially be security. We went after application monitoring first, but, we can talk about that more later. But there was nothing, the idea that this type of product had to exist, there was nothing wrong with that. We just felt that we could do it better, right? So it's very incremental. Sumo didn't start from some, business plan competition or three people, sitting in a dark room, trying desperately to think up a startup idea. It was, to us, it was just totally obvious that this was clearly going to be the next generation of this type of product, right? Moving it into a service. And then from our perspective, of course, leveraging AWS, because we had no idea about what a data center. I haven't seen one from the inside in a very, very long time, right? And just sort of use that substrate in order to build, what we needed to build and automate it all and, take the humans out of the picture for those places where they just shouldn't be in, right? And have one environment, have full control, not just over the code, but also the deployment environment, right? As you already said. Versus, getting stuck in London for 3 weeks in a bank, basically with no return ticket until you fix the bug. Like one of my guys got literally stuck in London at some point for that long. At some point, I compiled a custom JVM with additional instrumentation for a customer, just to figure out why, there was a particular bug and it had something to do with object allocation and, profiler tools were too slow. So hacked something in, recompiled a JVM, and they ran a Dash Christian version in production. I never thought that I would be able to recompile a JVM in the first place, but like banging on it for a night, it actually ended up working, and we got this sort of additional debug information that we needed.
Interesting,
crazy stuff, right? It just that the point is that this stuff just doesn't scale, right? And data sort of completely outscales this. Humans just don't scale exponentially, right? So, if the problem, however, scales exponentially, you have to find some sort of other way of solving the problem. And for us, that was, turn it into a service, full control over the code, over the development environment, refocus the customer back on using the product, right? And, we got there by, believing that we, are like this particular set of people, my co-founder and I, that we could actually pull it off, even though we had no idea about running services, data center, all of that type of stuff, because we didn't have to, considering that AWS took care of the problem. So that's kind of how it happened.
Yeah, the real platform shift there, right, is like, hey, AWS is going to manage all these servers. This whole SaaS wave is coming, and so
exactly,
you're right. The fundamental idea, like, we don't have to do the core value proposition differently. We just need to do the ancillary parts of this, which are, we're going to take away all the operational burden from you and give you a very familiar set of core, product value from this, right?
Exactly. Because we felt that it's just, you should just use the product and not worry about how the product, is implemented.
So that was 10 years ago. And so you started that and initially went after the biggest enterprises or focused on developers or small business. Where did you sort of see your initial customer segment?
Yeah, I think if you start a company and this was sort of VC backed and, we sort of, raised the Series A right away, before we had a product built, I think you always kind of end up maybe falling into this trap of thinking that, hey, this is going to be an enterprise play. So that's always a little dangerous, right? Because everybody wants to be an enterprise company because everybody thinks that's where the largest pot of gold is, right? And to some degree, that's also true. But, it turned out that our initial customers were much more mid-market. Lots of companies that themselves had, already, lots of digital companies, CDNs, that type of stuff, right? That themselves were probably already services, right? That's really how it started, because in the beginning, this whole discussion about, the data goes into the where? Cloud? We had to basically figure out how to sell that. So our initial customers turned out to be much more companies that were sort of philosophically, aligned with how we were thinking about the world, right? And then it expanded from there.
Okay, so interesting. So you went out, built this first product, thought you'd go close every big enterprise, hired the really expensive enterprise salespeople that probably had the Rolodex. They failed. And then you realized that your real customers that were willing to adopt, 8-10 years ago were more mid-market folks that were starting anew.
In a nutshell. Yep.
And is that the whole concept of did you actually hire the high paid enterprise salespeople and they didn't hit the first round of those didn't really work out?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's and look, that's as much it's a timing thing more than it probably is a real product thing. But yeah.
Yeah, ideally somebody should write a book where it says don't do that, but I think everybody just has to experience this themselves. Are you familiar with PTC? You know what that is?
Yeah, of course.
Of course, right?
Telemetric technology company.
Exactly. So that was our initial crowd.
Oh, funny. That your first salespeople from there.
Yeah. So that was very interesting. Very East Coast sort of culture versus us being, much more of a sort of West Coast culture, and was very very interesting. I like these guys, but they had a very different attitude to things. And so we had some really interesting kind of discussions. I got to know a lot of them, on their home turf as well, and sales guys and SEs and so forth. And there's still a bunch, that are here, right? But like sort of the first wave was definitely not easy, right? Because it was just not yet at all clear how to sell this and how to deal with the sort of obvious, objections around where the data lives and all that stuff. Yeah, but like we certainly went through a bunch of iterations on that.
So, which approach did you end up taking? Like the approach of, okay, well, let's collect, maybe only the metadata and process that, and try to reduce the amount of sensitive data that you were using? Or did you take the approach of, let's go after like every major certification and get the pen test through FedRAMP? Like which angle did you go, or some combination of both?
The latter. This type of product, you can't get away with just doing the metadata, right? You really have to have it all.
Got it.
And so that was really the only way to do it. We started with SOC 2, then we ended up, building around that. If you haven't done anything like that before, even something like SOC 2 is actually pretty hard, because, there's certain things that you need to do, but then you also have to sort of get into the groove of how to sort of work with the auditors and like how to have those conversations, right? And all of that. And then we got that certification, and HIPAA followed. And then we ended up doing PCI. I think we're like at the current level 3.2 DSS. So basically service provider level 1 certified, just like a bank, right? And then ISO, and we are listed as FedRAMP ready at this point. It's public information. So we're going, the FedRAMP thing is something we're doing, right? And it sort of these certifications get harder and harder. And by the time, even PCI is already, pretty tight. By the time you get to FedRAMP, it's like a whole different game.
And you just like this summer was when you hit the FedRAMP side. So like it's sort of, this is something that you've been building up over the course of 9 years, right?
Absolutely.
It's almost like an arms race, right? Like enterprises want more and more certifications, and like you kind of have to keep escalating like the level of data security that you have and that you can demonstrate.
Yes, but I absolutely. But at the same time, I think it's par for the course, right? And I think philosophically, you gotta have a way to convince yourself that you are not just like leaking your customers' data left and right, just from a moral perspective, right? In my mind. And so how do you do that, right? And you can like, we're not doing formal verification, right? This is like, as we know, even flight computers don't do that anymore these days, apparently, right? It's basically a very, very hard problem. And so the next best thing is like, hey, we have smart engineers, right, who have security background, and they're going to design a secure system. It's like, sure, they should try, right? But like, no, but I'm not going to buy that if you tell me that, right? Because we all know how easy, like, software has bugs, right, and et cetera, et cetera. So perfectly secure system is just really hard problem, right? And so you try your best, and then you're being open about what it is that you're doing. You think through where encryption is happening, where you need to encrypt, how do you do key management, et cetera, right? And you try to put that into the best architecture that you can come up with. And we did that early on, and obviously it's been evolving since, right? But like our first cut already was like very, very strict tenant separation and different keys for every tenant, and blah, 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 and so forth, right? So that put us basically, on a good talk track. Then we got it certified, and you can be very cynical about this whole certification thing, because in the end, depends a little bit on some level also how you present it, and there's no perfect way for an auditor to sort of really, really, really test that like every single word that you say is definitely implemented that way without bugs, right? So there's a little bit of sort of softness in that, but still, by the time you're done with an audit, these guys are no joke, right? Even for SOC 2, you are starting to sort of update your processes. You maybe have a couple of fixes in the way that you manage data, encryption, et cetera, and you keep doing that. And it's expensive, both in terms of actual money, but also in terms of time spent and, maybe opportunity cost, if you want to say that, because there's some real engineering that's going on. I actually don't think it's opportunity cost, but, you could argue that you could build a feature instead, right? But in the end, I think the certifications and that whole process helps you to have more and maybe the best confidence that you could possibly have that your system is as tight as you can possibly make it to the best of your sort of abilities, right? And I think that's the bar that you need to set for yourself. Apart from the fact that, if we lose somebody's data, the company is going to be in a really bad place. It's also just for me personally, I don't want to be that guy that loses your data. That's just not okay. So that's why we go through all of these things.
Yeah. And I mean, and it's interesting because, it's kind of similar to just even like testing your code where you're like, nah, like, why would I need to test it? Like, I wrote it and it works. Like, I couldn't have screwed it up. And then you realize like there was a bug, and like that bug is the thing that led to it. So doing these sort of security audits and all of the different angles and threat modeling and vectors gives you sort of a context and ability to find different angles and areas that like you didn't really think through, or there might be a bug, and to sort of add, security and depth, and, in order to prevent as many of these issues as possible, right? Like obviously, it's hard to have perfect security, right? It's fairly impossible, but you can get pretty close by really being focused. So
it starts from, being essentially a business imperative, because you have to be able to handle the objections, right? And it's a moral imperative on some level, if you want. At least it was for us. And then there's a huge investment, but that's pretty differentiated for us today, right? It's part of our value prop that, we actually have all of these checks and balances in place. In our world, like, among our competitive set, we are far ahead of anybody else there, if I might say so.
And so, like, if we dive into any of those security features specifically, so you mentioned like key management. Did you end up doing like enterprise key management, like EKM, where the customer controls the key and then you sort of take it and cache it for 10 minutes? Is that a thing you do or not?
So when we started, that was not possible. So we ended up with something like, again, this is like 10 years back, right? I mean, Amazon has, like AWS has services for everything, probably including podcast recording at this point. I don't know. We just have two Alexas talk to each other. But, they didn't really have HSMs available, like these hardware security modules at the time when we started. So we have a slightly different scheme there. The, integration with the HSMs is something that, we are going to very likely have to do in a fairly short order.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't, cover everything, right? There's still like, you still have a key and you're still processing unencrypted data. So bugs can still happen.
Oh, yeah. It's a trust thing, right? And so, what happened with, us being able to sort of, I guess, fairly intelligently talk customers when they came over, through what we're doing, and then have the certifications to basically lend it additional sort of oomph. We had like, like early on already, right? We had like guys come in, when you're a startup and, you're funded by, like in our case, we have like name brand VCs, right? Then, all kinds of interesting people will show up and, try to take a look at your company, including delegations from, European, telcos, right? And of course, then you're going to have the meeting and you have a bunch of like, in walk these like 8 Swiss guys, very stern with their kind of, blue suits, right? And then we're sitting there with, anime t-shirts and long hair. And they're just looking at us through their, Porsche design, eyeglasses. And they're like, what is this? And then, of course, the first thing is, because they're a big service provider, right? Telco, what have you. Of course, they try to completely nail you on this data management thing. And then we talk them through it. And like, I could see one guy basically just kind of go and, poke the other guy with the elbow. And, they look at each other and they whisper, like, man, these guys are doing more than we do.
Yeah.
Right. So it was really interesting kind of observations along those lines. Yeah. A lot of people actually have this question, but they do a lot less actually.
Yeah. It's a really, interesting, piece. And it's just so critical, right? And so do you feel like in the last few years, the sort of expectations for customers around your data security and like data privacy, even with GDPR stuff, do you feel like that's just continued to escalate?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for good reason, right?
Yeah. You're even often listed on your customers' like, GDPR sub-processor list, right? Because I'm guessing that the data that you're ingesting from, some of your biggest customers ends up having consumer data in it as well, right?
Inevitably, we can't categorically exclude it, right? So there's a chance, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's explicit because, they want the data to be there. And then sometimes it's just, it could happen because, collection and, sifting through the data before, it goes into the next system. Frankly, whether that's on-prem or in AWS or SaaS is very hard, right? Classification of all this stuff.
I'm guessing your customers asked a lot of questions around that, and when that was a really hot topic, and now there's CCPA and these other pieces too. Is this a thing that you kind of continuously feel pressure from your customers around having answers to?
Yeah, and rightfully so, right? There's got to be some way of giving consumers some peace of mind, right? That, not every single gesture they have, do every day, and every single thought that they think on a daily basis is getting exploited for commercial reasons. Data leaks and, this whole election thing and, the Cambridge Analytica thing and the Facebook thing and all of these things, whether these were the right things to bring these topics in the forefront of the discussion or not, we can argue. But like the fact is that there's some pretty systematic surveillance, right? That is basically the price that you pay for interacting with things on the internet. And there's got to be some amount of governance for this, right? To sort of basically align what companies do, morally also, I think, where people sort of sit from a values perspective, depending on which society they're coming from. Pretty abstract thing there, but like...
No, I love it because I think it's like I've been sort of thinking about this more and realized that one of the things that's happened with this, like the zeitgeist changing about how people think about data and their data, I think that companies have started to realize that every piece of data that they process, they don't necessarily own, right? Just because like I as a consumer give you data about me and you can process it and use it something that you're going to do for me doesn't mean you own that data. Instead, you're really like a custodian or a steward of that data. And so it changes the relationship that the primary like receiver company like of that data gets with that data, where now they think about like, okay, well, who should I be sharing this with other than, without your permission? And so there's all these sort of, down the line implications that I think are really, really important and really interesting. And we're just starting to see the effects of it, right?
Yep. And then on the flip side is that the way that regulators might think about this, right? Right to be forgotten, data deletion, that kind of stuff. Once you flip that back into the sort of technical realm, it becomes, it can quickly become an intractable problem, right? And I think that's where, on the flip side, then, feedback from technical folks has to also be heard. It says, hey, being able to sort of, delete individual bytes basically out of very large databases or, aggregations of data is fundamentally, technically, probably almost impossible, without having blast radius, without like deleting other things along with it, et cetera. So I think it's more kind of a moral code than anything else, right? And then, obviously there has some technical implementation behind it, and there has to be, checks and balances in place. What I hope is that regulators are not going to sort of defy basic principles of computer science and, end up asking us stuff that we can almost basically not do. And that becomes then an exponential cost and so forth and distraction. So I think there's a middle ground for that. But fundamentally, I do think this discussion has to happen.
Yeah, because you mentioned append-only earlier in reference to ArcSight. Is Sumo also kind of append-only oriented?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, when you query the data, we will obviously it's kind of record-based, but the records all come out of large blobs, right? We don't have record addressability in our backend, right? It's not like every log message becomes a row, right? Every log message is part of a much larger batch of other messages, right? And so the batches are addressable. So that's where it starts with.
And oftentimes for security, you need that log of history and you need the immutability of this, right?
Exactly. I was going to go exactly to that one next, right? And to some degree, the fact that, what we do, the way that we store the data is in fact in blocks in S3 in an immutable fashion is very much a feature of the system that, some regulations actually require, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And then you run into this interesting competition between regulations where, one regulation says, I should be able to delete that record, but it's in direct violation of the other regulation that says you absolutely cannot delete records. So.
Right. It's like know your customer versus like GDPR, right? Like, hey, I did all these financial transactions like on your system, but like now go delete all my information, right? Like what? That doesn't seem like a thing that should be able to happen. So is that kind of what you're talking about?
That's exactly what we're talking about. Yep.
Yeah. Do you know, like, is there any precedent in that? Like, in terms of how that should be handled or what the sort of legislation, because this is the interesting part to your point, like the legislators don't really understand the technology, or the implications or necessarily even what else has been regulated. So, is there any kind of precedent around how that's supposed to be handled today?
I'm not sure whether there's kind of a national or sort of, global, precedent. Like our stance on that is that we will mask data, right? On demand if this GDPR thing comes up, but like in customers that have, let's say, governed by PCI as well, which is a lot of them, we're not going to delete it or mask it.
So you're basically saying you can go in there and do some type of encryption, or what are you doing to mask? What does that mean? Like redaction, or?
Yeah, we basically redact it on the read path.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Right. So that, for all intents and purposes, people can't see it.
Interesting.
But the encrypted bytes are still on disk somewhere, right? Unless the customer, allows us to basically, delete entire time ranges, then we'll blow those away, right? But then, along with the 3 messages that you want to delete, you're going to delete lots of other messages as well, right? And that we can do, and we do that also.
Oh, and do you have like a I don't know, some kind of Merkle tree or something in the background that's like taking a hash of the data every like few minutes in order to prove immutability?
So no, actually, we are not at the level where we need to prove immutability.
Okay.
But if you had to, yes, you would do sort of these hash chains or what have you. Blockchains, I guess. So yeah, maybe we should have become a blockchain startup. I don't know, but
well, no, it doesn't necessarily have to be. We don't need to publish it to the internet, right? You do use it yourself, right? It's still a primitive. I don't want to be accused of trying to say you should blockchain this.
No. I guess I was a bit snarky here, but it's really about sort of degranularity of addressability of data, and so individual records are basically because of the way that the system is constructed, individual records can be masked, but not on their own be deleted. Instead, we can kind of delete blocks of data, right? So, and in many cases, that's all that's needed, right? It's just that, you don't get just the 3 messages. You might blow away a bunch of other stuff as well, which, and in many cases, that's an easy trade-off. So it really depends on the customer.
Very cool. It's interesting. So it's a problem that I've thought about, and it really exists no matter where the data lives, right? Even if you delivered your software to the customer for them to run it privately, they still need to figure out a way to handle these kind of requests themselves. So
exactly right, and I think what we have there is really us, trying to do the best we possibly can, and with the right mindset, I think goes much further than what a lot of companies, if they are trying to do their own backup management and what have you, will be able to do themselves.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, by the time the tapes are, in the Iron Mountain truck, somebody comes in and says you need to delete something. You cannot tell me that people go and bring back all the tapes.
That's
right?
So true.
And delete individual records from those, and they're gonna pretty much, if at all, burn the tapes. So,
yeah.
Talk about that for blast radius, right? So, anyways, there's some really interesting implementation issues. Generally, we try to face them head on and be just clear, right? Here's what we can do, and here's the trade-offs, right? And then, we engage with customers, and we have good relationships with those customers. We have, pretty good team that, is both technical as well as knows how to sort of, deal with these types of emergencies where, often the customer is also fairly stressed, as you can imagine, right? And I think we've developed some good procedures on how to deal with that, and with our customers, we're just open about it.
And the other sort of high level point is that like platform shifts like the cloud and in sort of infrastructure as a service, it creates opportunity, right? So these changes, if you and your business can adapt them and you can create solutions, it creates a new way for you to bring additional value to your customers. So that's how I always perceive these things.
Yep, I feel it's fundamentally what we can kind of add back to their sort of operational maturity, and to their sort of if they also use us for sort of security analytics, for their security posture, far outweighs in my mind what they can possibly do on their own or even with sort of legacy products. So it becomes a trade-off, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the customers from day one, customers, that came over to Sumo and, are using our product, and, still today, they understand that trade-off. It's just it's not absolute, right?
Right. I mean, nothing is really black and white. Everything is shades of gray. And I think that's the important lesson that we always take to things.
Yeah, and coming from a technical background, of course, we're sort of almost pre-programmed to think that it's either true or false, right? And
right.
If anything, even more so than architecture or what have you. The one thing that I've learned is that the world is very gray.
Yeah, exactly. So kind of similarly, like, right, in a less about regulation, maybe we go there, but you have some sort of interesting perspectives on the social implications of AI. Is that something you sort of want to talk about?
Yeah, I did a couple of talks on that topic, right? This kind of goes a little bit along with, I guess, what you called zeitgeist earlier, over the last, couple of years. And so obviously, I've been doing data now for a very long time, right? I mean, my career basically is about building systems that sounds almost trivial because I guess I'm just defining computer science, but the basically data management, right? So data and making getting data into one place, and then you're making analytics possible, and drive decisions based off data is something that I've always done, right? And that's kind of very much at the core of my career. And this is something that is becoming it's become a topic, right? For business, digital transformation, everything becomes, ultimately measurable. If you think about how modern business works, it's very much based on the, IT systems that, that process the data for the business, right? And I think that's all well and fair. Along the lines, we've also sort of seen this reemergence of, I guess, machine learning, and then people very quickly jump to AI, and that it's obviously been a topic, before, and large expectations then ended up not playing out in the 80s and all of this type of stuff. So these things are also cyclical, right? But I think we're still we are in a new hype cycle around generally sort of the expectation of what smart algorithms can do with data in order to make better decisions, right? And I think there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you are in many ways, that's, what we're selling at Sumo as well, right? And it's just a fundamental functionality that you need to have in order to run your business better, to have better analytics, better decision support, whether it's about the functioning of your IT systems or your security or the business itself that's driven by those systems, right? But at the same time, like with everything that's, being hyped, people sort of start developing, blind trust in something, right? And it's clear that the advances in ML, in the last, by now almost 10 years, right? Deep learning and so forth, are amazing. And if you can compare before and after when it comes to sort of say image recognition, right? It's just it's a total step function. But I think what it's also been leading to is sort of this idea that machines can somehow, or algorithms can somehow make better decisions than humans, right? And I think in the broadest sense, that's not actually true. I don't actually think that, as much as I'm, a fan of, making data-driven decisions, I don't think data alone makes decisions, right? I think it's still there in support for humans to sort of add, their own special sauce. Whether you have bias or not, just admit it, you will have bias, right? But your intuition still matters, when it comes to decisions that you make about, how to conduct yourself or how to conduct your business and so forth. Something that kind of was sort of interesting to me was there's in light of all of this hype is, what happens if this blind faith in data leads to people making decisions about other people, right? And then so that's kind of a slightly different sort of sphere where you have all kinds of potentially unintended consequences and side effects on a sort of more on a level of society, right? And so something that kind of opened my eyes to that quite a bit is this book called Weapons of Math Destruction. It's a nice pun in there by Cathy O'Neil. I think that was probably the first thing that came out that was basically trying to take a look at sort of these social implications of blind faith in algorithmic decision making. And here we're not talking about, trying to show somebody better ads. Here we're trying to talk about trying to figure out whether they will commit crimes again and whether or not to let them out of prison, or, whether they are good teachers, or whether they're worthy of social services, keeping their children and so forth, right? And there's a couple of sort of literature that came out in the last couple of years looking at sort of the societal effects of this sort of basically blind faith in algorithms making better decisions than humans. And like I kind of sort of try to wrap my head around that a little bit, right? But I came to the conclusion that data fundamentally is human, right? It's generated by humans, it's ultimately consumed and analyzed by humans, and machines can help, but machines alone I don't think can be trusted in all cases to make the right decisions. Machines making, I guess, decisions about other machines is one thing, but machines making decisions about humans, I think there's a lot of potential issues there.
Interesting. And so categorically you'd be pretty much okay with machines making decisions about machines?
So I guess, that was me trying to kind of on the fly abstract things like, ad placement and so forth, right? Sort of, machines making decisions about machines, making decisions about people, that could become sort of a fallacy, right?
Sure, because it's like bits, meat, atoms everywhere. But I guess, I was just thinking about, as we talk about optimizing performance of a database, like some type of machine learning to determine that, like feels there's not a lot of blast radius for that, right?
I totally agree, right? But I think it's so the reality is that I think when things happen that have effect on people making decisions about people, or basically people outsourcing decisions about people to algorithms, is that the stuff is not usually even that sophisticated. It's usually a bunch of models, right? And sometimes it's just a bunch of questionnaires, right? But the idea is that it creates some sort of score, right? And if the score is below the threshold, then you're not a good teacher, and all of that, right? So, or you are not going to get released from prison because the chances are that you are going to commit crimes again. And then you look at the questionnaire, and it's like, it asks all these questions about which neighborhood do you live in and what's your race, right? And the idea then becomes that these instruments are trying, people are building these instruments, algorithms, and so forth, because they are weary of this sort of messy, part of human decision making, and it potentially being biased and not fair and all of that, right? So they say, hey, if I can abstract that out into an algorithm, then clearly, algorithm doesn't have bias. Algorithms, make fair decisions, data in, data out. But based on everything that I've seen, and it's in many different examples laid out in book that I mentioned, and there's a couple of other books that came out since then. The reality becomes that the problem that people find themselves then, if there's or think about credit scoring, it's an even simpler example, right? The idea is that you have an algorithm basically make decisions because it is supposed to not be biased, because you are weary of humans making biased decisions. But what happens is that if you look at the way that instruments and algorithms are designed, what people find is that it's not actually that easy to, or it seems almost impossible to design an algorithm or an instrument that doesn't actually perpetuate the bias of the designers, right? So, in the end, what comes out is anyways biased. But now, how do you appeal that? How do you appeal to a machine? The end result is actually it's actually worse than before, right? So that's kind of the line of thinking that kind of got stuck in my head, and I thought that was actually pretty interesting.
Yeah, no, it is. Though I think it actually incriminates something else, and this will be because I'm like I'll inform the audience. This is definitely because I'm like a fairly crazy free markets anarchist, right? And so generally my thought there is it actually is more incriminating of the centralization of decision making than it is incriminating of the AI. And so I think the challenge that we're facing there is we have a centralization of who's in prison, who's the child services, all these other things in terms of that we're outsourcing that to an intelligence that we call some centralized government. And in my opinion, we should be decentralizing as much of that as we can in a way to remove sort of how those decisions get made. And and using AI to make those decisions in an even more centralized fashion, I would agree is a challenge, but probably from a different perspective than you would arrive there.
No, we arrive at the same conclusion.
Oh, interesting.
On Great. Some level, right? Which that's good enough for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's very interesting, right? Because there's progress to be made, right? And I think we just have to continue to sort of negotiate, what the right sort of application is of these types of tools, right? And We talked about this earlier. The world is really gray, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's actually a perfect sort of lead into this discussion. People, however, desire it not to be gray, right? They desire it to be black and white. And if there's like tools available that like promise, to turn the gray into black and white, I think any which way you get there, it's both extremely appealing to people, but also extremely dangerous.
Yeah.
Right. And, centralization is one thing. Blind faith in algorithmic decision making is another thing, where, people fall into the trap of thinking that there's some sort of, magical device that can turn the messiness of the real world into sort of a simple black and white thing. But the reality is, if you are in a position where you need to make decisions about other people, you just can't outsource that into a black and white kind of, 1-bit output system, I think. Yeah, I mean, that's what I think, right? I do think that, intuition matters. And I don't think that there's a magical device to remove bias. People are inherently biased. There's nothing you can do about that, right? Certainly algorithms are not necessarily the solution, I think.
Yeah, and I think, one thing that I tend to believe is that leveraging data to help inform decision making, but maybe, keeping a human in the loop is a really interesting perspective, where we should be informed of our biases. We should be informed all the things that we might be taking in sort of, hopefully systems and computers can help us make better decisions. But ultimately, I do believe a human in the loop is important. So
there's this thing that people throw at me all the time, which is this you probably have the visual, right? In God we trust, all others must bring data.
Right.
And so there's basically, two of my least favorite statements in together. I do actually believe that data is important, but I'm 100% with you. I think, it's still the human that makes the decision, right? And of course you need to look at data, right? But you also need to understand, if I have somebody who tells me that they are making decisions based on data, okay, that's not a bad starting point, right? But then I also need to understand what's your intuition, what's your experience, what's your context, because the data alone doesn't necessarily help me there, right?
Yeah, I mean, realistically, it's so many people are so bad at statistics, and you can look for whatever truth in data that you might want to, and so it's great, okay,
including myself.
Yeah, of course, we all can.
Yeah.
So one other, just kind of back to Sumo for a bit. When you think about where Sumo is in terms of emerging technologies, and if it's ML or if it's I noticed that you have a pretty big call to action around Kubernetes.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of these trends that you're seeing that you're really that could be platform shifts today? Is Kubernetes one of those main ones?
I think Kubernetes is interesting because it promises a simplification and an abstraction over these emerging deployment sort of options, right? Because suddenly, just being able to deploy in AWS isn't good enough anymore. You need to be multi-cloud, right?
Mm-hmm.
For example, right? Or you need to be hybrid or whatever it is, right? And so now we're back to, hey, your software doesn't just have to run on Windows, it also has to run on Mac, or, iOS is not good enough, you also need Android. It seems to me sometimes that people feel that Kubernetes is, and I've certainly gone down that route myself, so I'm not just saying other people, but it occurred to me as well that Kubernetes could be an interesting layer of abstraction as a sort of portable platform as a service, right? And I think that's kind of why people have sort of picked up on it so much. Probably less so. To some degree, it feels like, Kubernetes coming out of, the sort of Google Borg thing. I don't think Borg was, the stuff that the Google guys are doing wasn't necessarily designed to support across, deployment, systems and so forth, right? They have one and it just needs to really, really, really scale there, right? And they built a lot of, and they discovered a lot of stuff and, build it into that. And, Kubernetes is kind of the open source version of that, of course. And originally what I thought it was a way to build, more easily build really large systems. But when I sort of, which is I think what it was originally intended for, certainly that kind of would seem to be obvious to me, knowing from where it's coming from. But it feels like the market is picking it up as a way of actually maybe not even build the ultimate hyperscale system, but build lots of sort of reasonably scalable system in a modern paradigm with microservice orientation and so forth, and some amount of horizontal scalability, and use Kubernetes as a abstraction layer, so to not necessarily have to commit to any given deployment substrate. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I totally agree.
And of course, your company kind of, obviously I'm sort of preaching to the choir, I guess, right? Because that's kind of my understanding of what Replicated is really leveraging as well.
Yeah, exactly. It's enabling Kubernetes. Our whole thesis is that, one, we do kind of believe that Kubernetes is sort of this patterns and primitives of building reliable software.
Yep.
And so, we'll often talk about how, if you remember, if you use containers or any of the like Linux C groups before, like everybody kind of wrote their own like way to manage that, right?
Yep.
It was like there was Mesos and there was, Uber had something called Peloton and Facebook had Tupperware and everybody had these like things that were basically all inspired by Borg. And now we sort of see the community moving to this like canonical implementation, and it's providing some of these patterns and primitives of like how do you actually build out something in a reliable, scalable fashion. And, I would say just like there's primitives for security, for encryption, and it would be insane to write your own encryption algorithm today, we think that the same thing is happening for reliability. And there's now these reliability primitives, and it would be sort of insane to write your own orchestration and scheduling tools today.
Yeah.
Caveat, Replicated did write our own orchestration 5 years ago. So like part of that is from firsthand experience.
Yeah, of course.
but yeah, as we all make those mistakes, we generally believe that there is this interesting platform shift, right? And that is if everything moves to Kubernetes and instead of that old world of racking and stacking servers, you can start to, deliver, like you can bake a lot of that operational knowledge that all of those old customers at ArcLight had to like figure out for themselves. You can bake that into a single manifest and deliver the images to a customer and they can run it in their own Kubernetes cluster. Like it starts to really solve some of those operational overhead problems of the old world. And then in this new sort of world of data privacy and security requirements, it allows a vendor to solve some of those problems without having to process the data because they can just deliver the app to where the data resides.
Yep.
But, I'm guessing your team is using it more of like you're seeing more Kubernetes environments that customers have. And so you're trying to help people take control of what's going on in their own Kubernetes cluster and use that as a source for events and things. Is that right?
Yeah, of course. So fundamentally, we are sort of a log analytics and monitoring or observability platform, if you want. But that's what we do. Basically, in short, we help people, run their systems in a reliable fashion, right? So that's one aspect of what we do, and the other aspect is make them run in a secure fashion, right? So clearly we have seen, Kubernetes to become a thing that we now also need to be able to monitor because people are using it, right? And then, they need to keep that reliable, and here we are. So we built a bunch of, because, Kubernetes introduces a couple of new concepts and so forth. So then you want to evolve your product as well to kind of present those mental models, that go into, into sort of the design of Kubernetes per se, but then also sort of the way that this plays out into your own applications, topology-wise and so forth, present some of those mental models back to a user to make it easier for them to manage their reliability. So that's kind of the sort of product aspect as far as Kubernetes is concerned for us, right? And, then of course there's lots of security aspects to that as well, container images and so forth. So the divide between operational stuff and security anyways kind of goes away, and in these modern environments even more so. And then the other aspect is that, we are also, starting to use Kubernetes ourselves, right?
Oh, cool.
If we had started a company a couple of years ago, it would have probably already, be Kubernetes native. But we started it in 2010 when none of the stuff was available. And so we are kind of, our core architecture is still very, very much focused on, EC2 and lots of automation tools that we wrote ourselves. So we have a version of everything that HashiCorp eventually released. So it's pretty interesting.
Funny.
Which was a blessing back then because we had the tooling, and now it's more of a curse because it's idiosyncratic, and if we hire new people, then they might already know Terraform, right? But they might not necessarily understand our own thing, and then we need to teach them. And so again, whatever you do, you can't win.
Yeah.
But hey, here we are. We're still alive and kicking. So and I think that the decision to write a lot of our own automation tooling on top of the AWS API in 2010 is part of what got us here. So it's all good.
Yep.
And so the other thing that's kind of noteworthy for me when as far as Kubernetes is concerned is that, and this goes back to kind of, I guess, sort of this maybe sentiment that I expressed earlier, which is, Kubernetes is something that came out of one of the largest hyperscale companies ever, right? And then, the competing sort of systems, internal systems that you referred to, Facebook, et cetera, those are also, these guys run at scales that most of us, including Sumo, right? And we run at pretty large scale, but nothing compared to Google, obviously, right? A lot of applications don't actually need to scale to that level, right? And it's quite interesting that the adoption of Kubernetes is also somewhat removed from this absolutely top 5 hyperscale kind of aspect of it. So it seems to scale down pretty well as well. is quite cool. And then the other sort of thing that I, in light of all of that I noticed is that actually Kubernetes ended up being a topic with a lot of our enterprise customers that are still running a lot of stuff on-prem, right? Because, Sumo itself is a service, but, we get a lot of data from on-prem, right? I mean, hybrid environment is a reality, right? Like Silicon Valley, we have a bunch of startups and all that. Of course, they don't have on-prem, but, enterprise customers and even mid-market customers, depending on who they are and where they are, and, where they are in their own, maturity history. Of course, we get lots of cloud workloads, but a lot of the workloads are on-prem. And so the enterprise customers really have, picked up on Kubernetes, big time. Sometimes I feel like even more so than some of the sort of more modern guys, because the sort of more modern people, then they go and like, not necessarily we see Kubernetes there obviously as well, but like we then also see things like serverless and just straight up AWS, ECS, etc. So the part that was interesting is, how much the enterprise AT has, in my observation, jumped onto sort of Kubernetes, because I think, I don't know what your take is on there, but on that, but it feels like it gives them a little bit of sort of, warm and fuzzies, that there's still something that sort of requires operational management, right? Versus this sort of utopia that, everything's serverless and you just write a bunch of functions and some sort of background system that you can't even see or manage or have any sort of, physical approximation to, it's just magically running your software. So I don't know how you feel about that, but I thought it was quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we see it adopted, and I definitely think there's some aspect of control, to your point, right? Like there's some control that folks want, but I think there's also just an area of like, to the shades of gray thing, right? I think that's a common theme. It's just like they're going to have systems that are in data centers or in multiple different places, and having a platform that they can move to that's going to be portable and is going to be like, it helps them kind of prepare for the future, right? And then additionally, just like if you're trying to build new software, I mean, we think, to digital transformation world, like everyone has to become somewhat software native.
Yep.
And if they're going to do that, like you have to build software with like a great SDLC and a great environment, and using the sort of, tools that grew up inside of Google and were competing with a lot of different technologies and sort of emerged as the best in class solution for this, I think is the right way to do it. Because to your point, like you could write, all of your own versions of these things, but then it's just challenging to onboard new engineers and to fix it when it goes down, and then you're just it becomes less relevant over time. So, we just love the idea that like the ecosystem together has really come together to create such a robust solution for this.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy if you think what's possible in open source today, right? I mean, it goes from a couple tools, and then it goes to an operating system, and now it goes to a data center operating system, and it's all in open source. It's pretty amazing, actually, right? And then on the flip side, you have these sort of hyperscale clouds where there's a lot of proprietary stuff going on. So it's pretty interesting right now.
Yeah, I think it'll be a battle that continues around, customers wanting open source and companies that want to meet that challenge, delivering it. And we've evolved to do more open source. I'm sure you're doing more and more open source. Sounds like you're working with Falco and some of these other tools, and
yep.
And just the advantages that we can get by working together. And part of it's just recognizing that like the market is growing so much that you don't have to worry that much about boxing out competitors, but rather like, hey, if we just all try to build really great systems and we do it somewhat in the open, and even if we collaborate with folks that are somewhat competitive, like if we grow the market enough, like everybody wins.
Absolutely, right. And this is one of the other things that we ended up, to some degree lucking into, I think, at Sumo. Look, the initial thesis was, let's basically take this sort of security management and maybe a little bit of sort of, application management based on logs, turn that from our experience, turn it into SaaS, right? But in like what has happened in the last 10 years is that it's just becoming about data, big data, not necessarily structured data. It goes very far in some of our customers' use cases away from, using these tools to keep the systems, reliable and secure. And it goes into understanding the business itself, right? Using these kind of like flexible, agile analytics tools that we have in a system like Sumo. And so now we are out there in a market that is, depending on who you ask, anywhere between 40 and $70 billion a year, right? That's absurdly large. To your point about, rising tide lifts all boats.
Yeah.
So that in 2009, 2010, I could not have even predicted that. But this, everything that has to sort of do with, making data, available to people to make decisions. Hopefully they are not taking the data blindly and all of that, as we just said earlier. But it's becoming such an incredible market that, I think there's a lot of different companies that can create both good outcomes for customers as well as for themselves and their employees. So
yeah, does that kind of play into the kind of topic you guys refer to as a continuous intelligence?
Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of our sort of absolutely highest level sort of, aggregation of what we think, is sort of going on in the business world, right? Where it's basically this idea that in order to stay competitive, you just have to be able to continuously, have data available to make decisions. Because it's really a rat race, right? And if the other guy can beat you to that, then, they're going to get all the money and you will get none. So to make it a little, maybe oversimplify it a little bit, right? But yeah, and I think the continuous intelligence thing, what it has to do with is, is like agile analytics, no, worshiping at the altar of the data warehouse to get a column added, like, half a year later and all of that. Have all kinds of data, structured, semi-structured, and what have you, unstructured in one system, and to basically allow access to that in a sort of democratized fashion across the entire organization, right? And of course, our strong point is around, keeping systems reliable and secure, right? But that, that's a huge thing. And, these teams, between developers and DevOps and Ops and, depending on and security, obviously, in whatever, form they are sort of sliced up in whatever, corporation you're in, organization you're in, these teams keep growing, because the sort of IT drives more and more of the business, right? And so once it's all IT driving the business, once it's all computers driving the business, everything happens at lion speed, right? And the people who can actually make decisions at lion speed, either automate it, and then we go back to sort of this classic optimization problem, what to show on the page in order to get the click, or just like a little bit more abstracted, strategic decisions or tactical strategic decisions, sort of on a weekly basis. What should we focus on? What should we feature on our e-commerce side, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's where the real competition is. And with digital transformation, everything, every product, like the sort of idea there being that like products more and more turn into digital products, right? And for us, I have been using, you've been using computers all your life. I have, right? On some level, this is all like, come on, what's new here? But the reality is that barely half of that market is even tapped into, right? And so that's kind of where a lot of the kind of opportunity comes from. And so our term for that is, continuous intelligence, right? And we see ourselves as a provider of continuous intelligence for our customers, for reliability, for security, and more and more so for business insight.
Interesting. So if we think about the arc of Sumo Logic, maybe it started off sort of more like reliability and looking at logs and looking at and collecting all these pieces, and then kind of continued to move into security. And then now you're saying like, hey, it's not just those two areas, but let's help the business make better decisions about like what direction to go or things to do. And let's expose this into more organizational functions.
Exactly. Because, if you think it through, once I have the logs and, maybe additional, time series metrics or what have you, but the logs for sure, right? Which is, we just really know how to do that very well. Once you have the logs, you have a lot of like diagnostic information on the systems, but these days you pretty much have all the transactions in there as well, right? And that basically that tells you what the business is doing, and then you can use that data to do better, right? And that's why I continue to be, and I'm sort of actually even more excited about the possibilities of what we can achieve as a company, because I always said, like 10 years ago, I got laughed out of a VC meeting at some point and saying that ultimately what we're building here is a new business intelligence, right? But they were like, no, come on, go away. but I think it actually is playing out that way.
No, it makes sense. I mean, because ultimately, like event data, one of the challenges with like analytics is that you end up like sampling and doing other things, and it's not always that accurate. And so like if you actually are ingesting like all the actual events for security and for compliance, like then the data you have is probably the most pure. And then being able to apply some additional like insight on top of that, gives you like the most accurate form of the data.
Exactly. And in a system like ours, right, you can do that by just walking up to it and writing a query, right? In the best case scenario, there's basically, and that happens actually a lot, you don't need to do any additional prep, right? Yeah. Now, if you want to run that query every 15 minutes, every day, then, might make sense to sort of maybe do some additional prep step there. But the initial answer you can get almost immediately. This is extremely powerful, right? And we use that ourselves all day, right? And trying to understand how people use our product, and lots of stuff there that helps us optimize the product, the way that we provision underneath, and all of that, which helps us save costs. And, that's back to being competitive.
Yeah. Like, is that where you think that like the future of Sumo is going to be going that direction over the next few years?
I mean, customers are literally using us for that already, right? And so from a startup perspective, and I still consider Sumo as a startup, I guess 10 years is a long time, right? But we are still we're not IBM who can just really nearly spin up entire new departments to go after something, right? So we're still in a situation where, and frankly that applies to every company, even IBM on some level, right? Still have to be very sort of deliberate about where you put the limited resources that you have. So very careful in terms of layering, these additional concerns. But I mean, customers are bringing us to that, right? I think, we're starting to sort of look at, that from the sort of messaging and positioning perspective, and then ultimately from the product feature perspective as well, right? It's interesting because I think the market for, just keeping systems reliable and secure is so large that I think we can have a very, very successful company for many decades, even if we never actually do anything else but that. But the reality is, just like when we started and we basically used logs only for operational analytics, customers immediately started using it for security analytics as well. And sort of, almost quote unquote, in a good way, tracked us kicking and screaming back into the security realm. And we were just trying to somehow keep a little bit of focus, right?
Yeah.
And I'm obviously very happy that we have all of these, now adjacent spaces, but we had to be very careful in when we could invest how much in, these various functionalities, right? The same is happening with these sort of more business focused use cases. And I mean, that's, I'll say that is a good problem to have. So.
No, it's great. And I think you think about, the company's arc, there's Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, you got to keep kind of, inventing yourself to continue to,
exactly,
to adjust to where the market is and to where you want to take it. So
exactly.
Christian, thank you so much, man. This was a lot of fun. I really appreciate all your time.
Likewise. It's good talking to you, sir.
That's all we have time for today. If you're interested in being a guest on this show, or if you'd like to suggest a topic, or just to learn more about enterprise features, find us at enterpriseready.io. To learn more about HeavyBit, visit heavybit.com to check out the library. It's packed with amazing talks on sales, marketing, product, and general management from founders of developer tools companies and other industry leaders. This podcast is also brought to you by my company, Replicated, where we enable cloud-native software vendors like HashiCorp, CircleCI, Snyk, and many others to operationalize and scale the distribution of their modern on-prem applications to their largest enterprise customers. Check us out at replicated.com.